Hi, Ted Morrissey here, doing a quick video from the American Literature Association Conference, which is being held this May 2024 in Chicago. And just wanted to give kind of a brief synopsis of some of the presentations I went to today and what we might as writers, what we might take away from them, well, but also as just literature people, that kind of thing. So, yeah, the American Literature Association is an association dedicated to obviously American authors, but it's comprised largely of literary societies. A lot of writers, if they develop a certain reputation, they're will form different literary societies, like the Edith Wharton Society, the Edgar Allan Poe Society, the Shirley Jackson Society, etc. I'm a William Gass guy, and I've been thinking for years that, gosh, I'm tempted to do a William H. Gass Society, but it would be a lot of work. And, I try to promote Gass's work and the reading of it and get people to be aware of it, sort of informally without actually establishing a society. If someone out there would like to take the lead on that and establish the William H. Gass Literary Society, you can count me as an active member, but I don't think I want to take on establishing that too. Nevertheless, that's the main reason I'm here this weekend, is that I did help organize a panel on William Gass. His centenary is in 2024. He would have been 100 had he was still alive, but he was born in 1924. So this is his centenary year. So we did a panel, William H. Gass at 100. And specifically, what I did was a paper, Let Us Now Praise William H. Gass's Greatest Work. The idea being that most people who know Gass, which aren't enough people, but those who do know Gass, especially as a fiction writer, they tend to associate him with his huge novel, The Tunnel, which took him 26 years to write. And so it has kind of infamous reputation in and of itself. And then it got very mixed reviews. Some people found it very troubling when it came out in 1995. But my point is that as great as that novel is, that Gass's greatest work is a collection of novellas that came out just 3 years later, Cartesian Sonata and Other Novellas. And this collection of four novellas is really the sort of pinnacle of Gass's literary achievement. And so my paper makes that point, and I'll give you a link to that. But otherwise, you could Google Ted Morrissey, Let Us Now Praise William H. Gass's Greatest Work, and you would find it. It went well. The paper presentation did. Unfortunately, we only had one person show up for the audience, and they got there late. But I kind of knew that was going to happen. We were slotted in the very first session of the conference Thursday morning, bright and early, and that's that's problematic because a lot of people, they're traveling to get to the conference that first morning, and if they're going to be involved in the conference that first session, it's probably because they themselves are presenting papers or chairing panels. So I wasn't expecting a big crowd, and besides, unfortunately, Gass doesn't draw a big crowd. Um, I'm trying to change that, but anyway, one person, so at least somebody showed up. But that's another reason why I do like to post my conference presentations on my blog, so at least hopefully people can find them, who aren't actually at the presentation. But nevertheless, that went well. So a couple of things. I'm not going to go through all the panels and papers I heard, but since we're all writers here, I thought I would try to focus on some writerly kinds of issues. This is not a writing conference. It's not a creative writing conference. It's a literary conference. But one of the panels that I was really looking forward to, and it did not disappoint, was a panel organized by the Shirley Jackson Society. I'm a huge Shirley Jackson fan. The Haunting of Hill House, the Lottery, the short story The Lottery, etc. And My writing has been compared to Shirley Jackson's, and that's just like one of the ultimate compliments I've ever received. So I have a lot of kind of similar interests in terms of what I write about and what she wrote about and how she wrote about them, etc. So anyway, some crossover there. And again, I'm not trying to say I'm Shirley Jackson, but there's some connection there in terms of interests and so forth. But the specific name of this panel was Shirley Jackson, Life Writing in the American Canon. And some very interesting papers. One of the papers by Robert Zipser, American Eve, question mark, Shirley Jackson's Subversion of the American Literary Canon. A lot of things were talked about in that particular paper, but the main thing was why did Shirley Jackson sort of get left out of the canon? Canon meaning authors that are considered sort of bedrock and important, and so they're taught again and again and again. And his research suggests that the canon was formed largely kind of mid-century by a group of male academics, and so they included almost all male writers in the canon. And Shirley Jackson, in spite of her popularity, in spite of how many people were reading her books and just the cultural phenomenon that her writing, achieved, that she was kind of hostile toward men. If you know Shirley Jackson's work at all, it's often men who are, described in the most negative terms, and it's the focus tends to be on the female protagonists, and so because of the male patriarchy dominance of academia, and because of Shirley Jackson's hostility towards male characters in her stories and novels and so forth, that she was basically left out. They just kind of ignored her, blacklisted her almost. And it's taken a long time for kind of a revival of kind of widespread interest in her work. Other panelists talked about things like the Netflix series The Haunting of Hill House and other movies that have been made, either adapted from her work or based on her life, etc., particularly the Elizabeth Moss starring and I think produced movie called Shirley, which is a sort of loosely biographical story about Shirley Jackson. But anyway, very interesting. Speaking of that movie, Shirley, another paper by Johanna Wagner, a scholar from Oswald University College, delivered a paper, The Problem of Shirley, Adaptation and the Author. And she talked about that movie, but other adaptations of Jackson's work, and the fact that we're kind of in the process of creating two Shirley Jacksons, the sort of public literary persona Shirley Jackson, and then trying to get to know the real Shirley Jackson, the real author, and who she was and what her interests were and so on. And so there's these kind of two different versions of her emerging. And then that scholar used the fact that that film, the Elizabeth Moss film, Shirley, was taken from a novel titled Shirley, which is sort of a revisionist novel, right up my alley. And so another way that she was using the idea of two Shirleys was the Shirley novel compared to the Shirley movie. And that really fit nicely with the third paper in that panel. This was by Alexis Fink from Virginia Commonwealth University. And she presented a paper, Between the Drafts, The Creation of Jackson's Life Among the Savages. And what she had done was she went to the Library of Congress, which is where Shirley Jackson's papers are, her archive. So she went through her manuscripts, et cetera, focusing particularly on the nonfiction book, Life Among the Savages. And one of the things that she discovered was that there's, even though on the surface there seems to be a really big difference between her fiction, her really dark kind of horror fiction, and then her nonfiction, which was oftentimes kind of funny and sarcastic, and she was published in a lot of women's magazines and so forth, and they seem very different. But if you really look at sort of the the origins, the original drafts of a lot of that material, there's a lot of crossover that you can begin to see. And then once you realize it's there, you can see it in the published versions as well. Right. So anyway, really, really interesting. For our purposes, again, we tend to talk about fiction and nonfiction as if they're these binary things, but obviously there's a lot of overlap, right? Our real life, whatever that means, certainly filters into our fiction, and our fiction, can also kind of filter into our views and perspectives, and then affect the way we actually behave and think in the real world or whatever. So it's really pretty interesting stuff there. So that was a really terrific panel. The other panel I wanted to mention, I went to some others, and they were good, but I'm just trying to keep this fairly brief. But I was really interested in, this panel. It was a Gothic horror in Poe and Lovecraft. I'm super interested in Poe, not in a scholarly way, just more as kind of a readerly way, really. But some really interesting papers there. I'm not as familiar with H.P. Lovecraft's work. So one of the three papers was focused on Lovecraft, and so I didn't get as much out of that just because I wasn't familiar enough with the material to really, understand the connections that the scholar was making. Manuel Martin Gonzalez, by the way, from Ankara State University. And the other two papers, though, really did resonate. One of them identifying the first incarnations of the American Gothic Carnival, analyzing the fall of the House of Usher through a new critical lens, Joshua Kalika, California Baptist University. And that paper was interesting to me because of the fact it focused on the fall of the House of Usher, which I think is a really terrific short story. And it particularly got into, this idea of the... it was more probably from the discussion afterward, but this idea of Poe sort of seeds the narrative with this idea of the house falling apart, but it's so subtle in the beginning that we don't really necessarily pay attention to it. And then when the house does, split apart at the end of the story, we've sort of been prepped for that with information we were given in the beginning. And then the other thing that's really interesting about that story that came up in this discussion, and I had never really thought about it this way, but again, as writers, this is really cool, that Poe doesn't really give us much of a description of the house other than those references in the beginning about, some indications it's kind of starting to fall apart. But in terms of the interiority of the house and kind of what it looks like, we get that from the intertextually inserted poem or song that's embedded in the narrative. And that's a really cool idea that that the intertext, the embedded poem or song or whatever, is giving us narrative information for kind of the frame of the story, right? And that's something we certainly could think about as a technique, right? So it doesn't have to be a poem or a song. It could be a piece of artwork embedded in a story or a novel that gives us important details about not the painting or whatever, but the actual kind of narrative frame that we're working in. I got to think a lot more about that. That's really cool. Another paper that was really of interest to me was The Francophobic Face of Poe by Amanda Louise Johnson of Pitzer College. Yep. And she talked about how the French Revolution was for Poe this really traumatic event because of the reign of terror and people being guillotined and yada yada yada, and that even though that was years before Poe and his writing, that historical event really impacted him, and he used that as kind of a metaphor for all kinds of horrific kinds of things. And you really see it in his nonfiction writing, which obviously doesn't get nearly as much attention today as his, short stories and a few poems and so forth. But in his nonfiction, particularly his book reviews, he was very, very critical of the French and described them as being sort of, lusting for blood and just very violent and aggressive and that kind of thing, which then is interesting because ultimately, the French really embraced Poe and were really critical in his sort of global, aura that was created because of the French's love of Poe, particularly Baudelaire, and then that kind of spread, throughout Europe, etc. But another interesting thing that came up in that panel, which is very much appropriate to what we think about today, is this idea of what do you do with an author, or a filmmaker or an artist or anyone like that, who's creating really interesting art, maybe beautiful books, beautiful artwork, beautiful movies, whatever it might be, but they themselves have some sort of ugly ideas or ugly details about their life. And J.K. Rowling and her, transphobic, ideas has really, colored, people's opinion of the Harry Potter series and so forth and so on. And we can go back and look at all kinds of examples of actors and directors and writers, whether it's Woody Allen or whoever it might be. And so the question is, can you dislike the writer, the director, the creator of the art, but still embrace their art, right? And even promote their art, right? And the reason that came up is because Poe was very pro-South, pro-slavery, anti-abolitionist, wrote a lot about abolitionists and how they were trying to destroy the South and so on. In fact, he compared what the North was doing to the South, what the reign of terror revolutionaries were doing to the aristocracy in France during the French Revolution, and so knowing that about Poe, he was a vehement racist by our standards. Does that color our love of Poe stories? Well, history has kind of erased that fact, unless you're a scholar digging into his writings, his nonfiction writings, etc., where he openly discusses his pro-slavery, anti-abolitionist views. We've just kind of forgotten about that, right? We just love his stories and his poems and that kind of thing. But it does resonate, like I said, in our current time. Now, I found the Poe panel particularly interesting because, as I've mentioned in my classes and in my podcast, for the last several months, I've been working on a new novel that the protagonist of the new novel is based on Edgar Allan Poe, inspired by Edgar Allan Poe. Several years ago, I wrote a novel called Untimely Frost, and I had two main characters being inspired by the biography and bibliography of Mary Shelley and Washington Irving. And I introduced into that novel a minor character named Byron Swinford, who in my mind was inspired by Edgar Allan Poe. But in my fantasy world, in my novel, Poe doesn't die a mysterious death, in the United States, as he actually did, but went to Europe instead, went to England, and became a sort of bohemian underground literary star. And so years later now, I've decided, what, even though he was just a minor character in that story, I'd like to explore that further. So I've been writing about this Byron Swinford character based on Edgar Allan Poe, and I got a ton of ideas from this panel discussion and talking about Poe that I know are going to impact my going forward and writing that novel and going back and revising parts I've already written or whatever it might be. I don't know what yet, but I just can tell that stuff is going to filter into my brain and it's going to impact my writing of this new book, right? And so I guess my bottom line, takeaway from all this is that even though this is not a writing conference, it is focused on literature and literary scholarship, specifically American literature and literary scholarship, it still seeds the creative imagination. And so, in addition to just reading, voraciously and reading as a writer, exposing ourselves to any kind of really interesting deep dive discussions about literature can be really helpful to our own writing efforts. All right. So, obviously, one way to do that is to go to conferences like this, but just again, finding a community of people who take literature as seriously as you do and like to have these sort of deep dive discussions about really good, really interesting, really serious work, right? One of the things I love about going to conferences is I'm with my people, right? In most of my daily life, I don't interact with people who think that seriously about literature and about writing, and they're not bad people, it's just that they don't have the exact same interests that I do. But you go to a conference like this, and you are surrounded with all these like-minded people, and it's just amazing the conversations you have and the ideas that you get, and just the way it recharges your battery as you come away from it with all this fresh material in your head. All right, so I'm going to stop there, and hopefully you got a little bit out of this video. And yep, I will see you down the digital trail.